everybody. This is David having a conversation today that is vital. It's part of our Vital Conversation series. And I'm here with Kylea Taylor and with Shabina Hale. So lovely to see both of you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And hi to everyone.
Hey, Kylea. How are you doing, Shabina?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to be here. Nice to be with you too.
Yeah, it's great to have you both. So, we were just talking about all being humans. I can vouch for that. And, I'm working at Psychedelics today. Kylea's a wonderful teacher, trainer, educator. And Shabina, you're, a professional therapist and a vital student. So vital conversations are coming at the level of being a human being. So a nice place to start is, can you tell us what kind of a human being are you? So if you maybe just tell the folks listening today, just a quick summary of who you are, what your work is, and the role of psychedelics in your personal, professional life and belief systems.
I'll start, I guess. I got interested in psychedelics and ethics in the Grof transpersonal training in the 1990s. I was a senior trainer working with Stanislav Grof and training facilitators of holotropic breathwork, and just noticed that people were getting into trouble who were ethical in ordinary states of consciousness work, but in this work they got triggered. And so I started getting interested in looking at that. And really what my mission is now is to share what I've learned and my observations with as many people as possible as this field is burgeoning. So that's what I'm doing. I'm a marriage and family therapist by license, and I'm very happy to be here with David and Shabina.
Thanks, Kylea. Lovely to have you. Yeah, and we had a great podcast last year, so if anyone wants to go check that out, it's in our archives. Shabina, hi there.
Hello. I am in the UK. I am a therapist, as you mentioned. I am an individual therapist, but also work with couples and as a sex therapist. I've been very interested in the last sort of 5-10 years in trauma therapy and starting to look at other sorts of therapies that kind of impact the brain and body and the neurobiology of people. And, through that development, I started to come across different kinds of models. And the clinicians at the clinic that I work with in London, we're all similar and have become quite passionate about the different ways of approaching therapy outside of the talk context, especially to be able to impact longer lasting changes. And probably came across psychedelics a couple of years ago. Was a little nervous initially because of earlier experiences, or perhaps even just social conditioning around fear of what that could mean. And then I started to read some of the research and got curious. And through doing IFS for a while and brain spotting for a while, I started to become familiar with altered states of consciousness. And I began to think, actually, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could get curious about what this would be like for people. And that exploration led me to start to want to train to be able to do it in a safe way, so I could understand the parameters of and the safety, not just for myself, but for the people that I work with.
Great. That sounds awesome. Thanks, Shabina. And you've both got quite a bit in common, obviously being therapists with brain spotting and IFS and holotropic breathwork. So let's see where the conversation goes. We are definitely talking mostly about ethics. So before we jump into that big subject area, I want to throw a question at you that we always ask guests in the Vital Conversation series. And the question is, what is one of the most vital conversations that you think we should all be having right now in regards to psychedelic therapy, research, medicine, policy, and culture? Kylea, do you fancy having a crack at that one?
Yes. Well, what I talk about anytime I can is how we really need to pay attention to scope of competence, how we have been trained to do this kind of work. And also, just in the field, I think if everybody just focused on how any decision that they're making would affect the experiencer who is taking a psychedelic, I think we would all be doing better with our decisions in the field, the regulators, the people in training companies, the practitioners, uh, just focusing on how can we do the best we can for that experiencer.
Mm. Yeah, and that's quite a skill in a sense, isn't it? To tune into self and other person at the same time. And we're going to be talking a lot about that. Yeah, thanks, Kylea. And how about for you, Shabina? What's one of the things that kind of pops up for you?
I think I'm kind of somehow just a little behind Kylea in beginning to bring in perhaps my own thoughts around the safety and the container for people, for the and the container meaning the environment, the set and setting that you're doing it in, and also you as a human being and how comfortable you feel in all these different places that you're going to go to with these people, and how we do that in the best way we can do possibly, for the health of ourselves and also for the people that we're working with. So for me, it really is similar, maybe less so. I never really considered the legislators or the regulators, or I always come probably from a therapeutic kind of stance of how can I not do any harm. And I guess my thing for anyone listening is hoping that they would also come from that position and begin to be questioning of themselves and what they have to offer and where they are with those offerings.
One thing I've thought of a lot is how this mainstream culture, they're getting a lot more familiar with psychedelics, but there's, I think, a lot of people who really don't know anything about psychedelics. And what we're going to have is people coming into the medical system, taking a psychedelic, and then going home to that network and that family who can't relate, can't resonate with what they have experienced. So I'm thinking that one of the things we could do in this whole system, since you asked that question, David, about the system, is really focus on practitioners making it possible for people who have had a recent experience to meet together, to have a sharing group so they could share their experiences and find out that they're not the only one and that they're not crazy, because I think they're going to be feeling a little outside of their network once they have had a psychedelic experience. And I think there's probably easy ways to do that, if practitioners get together and figure it out in their community.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Something I've noticed with quite a few Vital students that we've got, they're all over the world, literally, probably over 20 countries, I think. Some of them are the only, well, they seem to be like the only person in their village or town or state or even country that is interested in psychedelics or is talking about it or is brave enough to kind of look into it. So they definitely need some support there. And there's some, we've got a student that's enrolled that's in Nepal and Kathmandu for the next round of Vital. And she's like, yep, I think I'm the only one in this country so far who's doing this. So yeah, they need that peer support and supervision, but yeah, just support and conversations to be held. So it's not, I think one of the big risks, isn't it? The more alone we are, the more in a little silo and isolated we are, the more risk factors there are as well in anything, but especially with therapy and especially with psychedelics.
Yeah, I'm kind of, I mean, from my perspective, living in the middle of nowhere in a forest, 2 hours from London, I have loved having the internet because being able to do this program as well as be talking to colleagues in different countries has been really profound. And some of my peer groups are around the world, and those conversations that you can have, you wouldn't be able to necessarily always have. So there's some great stuff about the internet and having that availability for groups, even if we can't meet in person, you know.
I think that's a good point, that the practitioners need that kind of group support also, even not just in the training, but afterwards.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and something that we're hoping to continue with after students graduate, just to maintain the connection, but also, yeah, focus more on the supervision side of things, on the consultation and support. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about ethics. So what does that word mean? How do we understand it? And how would we kind of relate it to somebody in relation to psychedelics? Like, what's ethical? What's unethical? How would we know? What tests are there? And how maybe absolute and objective is this? Or how kind of relativistic or subjective is this subject of ethics?
Well, I teach InnerEthics, and I think most people think about ethics as what are the codes and the laws and the standards of care and all the rules, the what you do and what you don't do, mostly about what you don't do. But what InnerEthics is about is looking at what's inside you. And how I define it is, how do I feel like I'm in right relationship with whatever I'm in relationship with, a person, an animal, a group, and am I attuned to that? And am I a true well-wisher of that person or that group or that animal or that tree? So I think it's about relationship, and it's about really looking at ourselves inside to see how we can be more in right relationship.
Thanks, Kylea. I'm going to be accountable here and ethical. I just had to leave for about 20 seconds there because my father-in-law knocked on the door to deliver a guitar for my wife. So I did miss a little bit of that, Kylea. Sorry about that. But yeah, I'm practicing InnerEthics here live. Shabina, what were some of your thoughts that, how to just, touch the surface here on that question?
I mean, I think what Kylea just said about this sort of outer ethics is how I know ethics. I think I was taught ethics, back 20 years ago, and I had to dig out my ethics notes before I came to see you guys, because I was like, God, what am I going to remember? And actually, it was quite good actually digging them out, because I suddenly started to see the values and the principles that, the boards that I'm governed by remind me of. And I suddenly felt like I was in some sort of structure that felt a little safe. And it reminded me of the things that have probably become, under the skin over the years, that you kind of begin to take this familiarity. But at the same time, also knowing that those rules that I kind of try and abide by, they're not always black and white. They can sometimes mean that I am questioning, was that the right thing to do? Maybe I should have done that instead. And I'm really lucky to be in a profession which means that we are encouraged to go and talk to others, to talk through those dilemmas and question maybe the shades of grey that come up and what might be coming up for you in that experience with that person. And I'm really curious about Kylea's approach, because I do have a sense of internal, I don't know, conscience, if you want to call it that, that sort of sense of when it feels aligned within me, when I feel grounded in my decision making. And I know sometimes when I'm off that, and that helps me compass myself back to, why am I off this right now? Why is this making me feel uncomfortable? And so it's really nice to hear the experience of inner being talked about, because I think we all do have that somehow, and it's nice to hear that woven into this almost. I mean, you talked about accountability, David, and that word almost puts, like the fear of God in me. It's like, oh no, I'm in trouble. And there is an honouring, isn't there, of the work that we do, but that word almost sounds scary. It almost sounds punitive somehow, and it's the very opposite of perhaps how it should be, which is, we're all making mistakes, we're all growing. but at the same time, can we be responsible, to ourselves and to others, and to take some level of dignity with that? So yeah, lots of thoughts for me around that.
I think my first realization about ethics was from Stephen Gaskin, who was a guy in the 60s who went and started a big commune called The Farm in Tennessee. And he said, take care of the energy when nobody's looking. And I really always go back to that.
Wow, that's a golden nugget.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Say that again. Sorry, Kylea.
Yeah. Well, as the responsible party, or even just as anybody, as a human being, as David said, take care of the energy when nobody's looking. So it's, yes, there is accountability, but there's also self-accountability and feeling like you're really in alignment with good relationship with whatever you're in relationship with.
So this is going really well so far. Happy to keep going in this direction. We started off with ethics, then we talked about inner ethics, then an inner compass, and then when no one's looking, kind of just tuning into ourself. And I really feel like as a human being, getting to know ourselves is part of this ethics. Being good human beings is part of good ethics, and being a good practitioner and being really tuned into just where we're holding in that moment. When I did my social work clinical supervision training, it was a 20-hour training covering all kinds of different things, but there was a big ethical piece. And I wasn't surprised to hear that the biggest ethical breach is around sexually inappropriate relationships with clients, between therapist and client. The trainers were saying that is the number one thing that happens most often, that tends to trip people up because they make those decisions and they get caught, and then bad things happen, and it can happen in many different ways. And I feel like, is that also the case in the world of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? Do we know what the problems are around ethical breaches in psychedelics? It's been going on for a long time, in the West, but and even a longer time in more indigenous traditions. What are some of the ethical breaches we would expect to be more challenging? We have to be more aware of, more in tune of our kind of inner ethics and inner compass, so that we can manage those safely for ourselves and for the person that we're working with. What particularly about working with psychedelics would you say arises there the most?
I think it's the energy in the field. Speaking of taking care of the energy, everything is amplified. Stanislav Grof said that it's a non-specific amplifier, a psychedelic. And what most practitioners, most therapists don't realize until they've taken a training and they get told that it amplifies their own experience as well as the client's. So the client or the experiencer takes the psychedelic, and there is more energy available. There is more, whatever it is. There's more fear. There's more ecstasy. There's more joy. And that energy is transmissible. I don't know whether it's electrons or what it is, but it is transmissible and transferable. And it stirs up things in ourselves as practitioners. And things that are in our shadow or things that are in our unconscious get brought to the surface. And so we might have impulses or compulsions, or we might just be distracted by what's coming up in ourselves. And so we need a lot of experience in these, what I call extraordinary states of consciousness, both as an experiencer to work on these things that are in the unconscious, but also as a sitter or a practitioner, so that when, with hopefully somebody supervising in the room, as there is in in the Grof transpersonal training, for example, there's a lot of people sitting for experiencers, and then there are some people taking care of the whole room who are facilitators of holotropic breathwork. So you get to be a responsible party in a more limited way, but to really track your own experiences as they come up. So I think that's kind of missing in many trainings right now, because psychedelics aren't legal and people don't know about the breathwork option. Some of the trainings are including it, like Vital. But yeah, I think that we need more. And I think that's the key thing that we don't have in terms of training for scope of competence right now, as much as we should. But people can get it if they look for it in breathwork trainings.
Yeah, thanks, Kylea. Any thoughts from you, Shabina, on this subject?
Yeah, I've got my own experience of, actually, I often felt similarly when I would do brain spotting sessions with clients, which is also an altered state, but I think in brain spotting they call it limbic countertransference, which is when you start to sense something that's going on inside you. And they even have protocols to help you try and kind of clear that, so that you are clear for the person that you're working with. And I do remember my own experience of sitting in Holland when we went and having that very parallel experience to the people that I was sitting for, and also noticing it did amplify parts of me, and those parts of me I was very curious about afterwards. I was like, well, that's interesting that part really came up. Maybe it was just because it was my first time, or maybe it was just because of this. And so I do think that self-reflection and having a space for that to go and to talk about it. And, I did get to talk to people about that experience. And did I do that right? And is that how it's supposed to be? Because all those questions come up when you're first sitting, because it is completely unfamiliar, and there were people going through very difficult experiences at times. And for me as a therapist, that's not unusual to see, but it is for a prolonged experience. It's not for in a normal therapy session that might be, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Whereas in a psychedelic sitting, it can be for an hour or 2 hours. And, to hold space properly for that time, it's a tremendous, it takes a tremendous level of your own energy, which I think can be challenging, I think. So it's really interesting to think about the amplification, but also how you are resourced to deal with that when you're in that space.
And that's why I am focused on teaching in InnerEthics ethical awareness tools to help us identify our motivation when they come up, and to identify conflicts of interest, and to just be able to recognize if we're in one of those common ethically precarious situations, like dual relationship or transference or countertransference, or if there's power dynamics going on, that kind of thing. Because I think if we have easy tools and we start practicing them, it's so much easier to know what's going on quickly and make a choice to focus back on the client's best interests.
Yeah, I like how the conversation's recognizing that ethics aren't lists of kind of legalistic regulatory points. Yes, they will be and can be put down on paper in that way, but they're really skills, and particularly their internal skills. And you're focusing on that kind of the awareness there, kind of ethical awareness, Kylea, about how do we develop that? Like, what? That's a skill. How do we train someone in that? And we're saying, well, they need experience, like experience both maybe with non-ordinary states themselves, what that's like, and then experience sitting with others, and what comes up there.
Yeah. And I think we can practice it if anybody is in a training already right now. I mean, you can practice this by just tracking what's going on with yourself when you're in a challenging conversation or when you're in a room with people who are emotional. So how is that affecting what's going on? There's another track going on about ourselves while we're focused on the other person. And how can we be aware of both at the same time? And it just takes practice doing it. In fact, I think I heard a podcast once where somebody said that they were hiring a lot of people to be psychedelic sitters, basically. And they found that the most important prerequisite for this was some kind of meditation experience. Because in meditation, you're focusing for a long time, as Shabina said. And I thought that was interesting. So I think you can get that kind of experience in psychedelics or in breathwork, and you can also get it in meditation. But in meditation, you're probably not going to have some other emotional person that you're focused on, but you're at least learning to focus and track your own process.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder about some of those more difficult places. I remember when I first trained as a therapist, oh God, 20 odd years ago, that I really struggled with anger in the room. Really loud, big anger brought up parts of me that meant that I couldn't sit very easily and stay calm and regulated myself. But actually, sometimes that's what that person needed. And that wasn't something I could just talk about. I had to kind of unhook all my neurobiology around why my nervous system was getting dysregulated. And I do think that these amplified states are going to be possibly encountering some more challenging emotions that you need to know you can sit with, and not back out of when they're happening, which is what was happening probably for me in those early stages.
Yeah. And also not interfere with somebody else's process, what they need to do. Like, oh, shh, don't be so loud, is interference. Excuse me. But yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of those thoughts. One thing that I'm aware of in my head is that this is a burgeoning industry. There's lots of excitement around it. There's lots of uncertainty around what it's going to look like when it kind of hits the clinic, the hospital, the therapist's office. What's it going to look like in reality? We don't yet know. And we also don't really have a lot of the organizations overseeing and setting standards yet. They're kind of being built as we speak, at least in America. I'm not sure about the rest of the world, but I think pretty much it's a global phenomenon. Like, there's not yet sufficient accountability at national, state, international levels to say, hey, this is where the ethical code of conduct should be for working with MDMA or psilocybin in a hospital, in a clinic, with addiction, with mental health, with trauma, with adolescents, with geriatric patients. So these codes of conduct, kind of clinical practice guidelines, these real experiential knowledge hasn't yet been gained because we're still stuck, apart from ketamine assisted therapy and kind of more underground work and retreat work, we're still stuck in clinical trials. So we don't yet know like what could come up and how do we avoid ethical breaches from happening. And in a sense that could mean, so let's just wait and see what happens in the next few years and then we'll start learning about it. But actually I think the opposite, because we don't yet have good regulations and guidelines yet that are universally accepted and developed, we have to kind of double down on our training in our work around this, so we've got the scope of practice so that we're competent to say, yeah, I'm ready to do this work, I'm not ready to do this work, or I could do it like this with this client or not with that one. If this situation comes up, I need to really do that in awareness. Am I ready for this? And it might be I have that sense I'm ready for some aspects of psychedelic work and some levels of uncertainty, but not all of them. Because we have to be willing to accept uncertainty, but how much uncertainty? Because it's always going to be uncertain, whatever happens with medicine work, including preparation, integration. But I guess a question, because I think that tends to be what I do, how to put that into a question. Not predicting the future about where are we going to go, as a collective of practitioners, but maybe just thinking about, Kylea, what have we got to so far? And particularly I'm thinking of the MAPS, ethical codes of conduct, particularly ones that they introduced for the MDMA for PTSD trials. So what do they teach us? What kind of principles are they really saying are fundamental ethical skills and qualities for practitioners to have, and for client-patient interactions to embody?
As far as I know, that the MAPS practice code of ethics was last updated in 2021, and it's really a good overview of, it's aspirational. It's what we should do, what we should look inside ourselves. We should treat ourselves with compassion so that we can be good practitioners. We should pay attention to the extreme sensitivity and vulnerability of clients. And I think there's going to be much more research soon from one of my colleagues on suggestibility, the extreme factor of suggestibility. And I think we'll figure it out as we go along. But you said we don't know about ethics with psychedelics. And I think we do have resources that we could source. And one of those is the hundreds of years, eons of thousands of years of indigenous culture. And I just did a podcast with a guy in Peru who is trying to build bridges between elders and shamans in Peru who want to share their knowledge but feel like they're being ignored and also mistreated, exploited. And it seems like we should be building those bridges. And the other source is the ethical underground that has been operating for decades also. And there's people that have an awful lot of information and expertise that could put that to use. And I think what it seems like we're facing is that we have this round peg that's called psychedelic therapy. And it's trying to be fit into this too small square hole of the medical and psychological systems. And stuff is getting whittled off that round peg, which includes training and time in a session, and take the hallucinations out of the pill so that it can be given in a shorter amount of time and we don't know whether it'll have any effect, but it won't have hallucinations. So there's lots, and then certain guidelines have to be in place in the medical system that we have for legalization itself. And can we add the things that are important, because psychedelics are different. They're different. They're paradigm shifters. They open the doors to change in people and systems. So it's a very interesting time with all that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kylea. Really important, I guess, a couple of things that I hadn't thought about, but now I do, because you kind of put the seed out there. Ethics aren't just about the clinical interaction with the patient and the therapist practitioner. There's other ethics involved with the psychedelics industry around, cultural appropriation, where they come from, just understanding the history of psychedelics and colonialism, and looking at the ethics of the healthcare system, of the place that we live in. and diversity and inclusion of folks as practitioners, and accessibility of patients, and recognizing that there are a lot of traditions that grew up culturally, spiritually, kind of ethnically and anthropogenically, I think that's the word, with psychedelics and humans for centuries together. They were part of lived culture. So I wonder, from an ethical lens, any ideas just on that one? I'd love to hear if you thought about it. What were maybe some of the ethical pillars or touch points in some cultures, outside of the West, or even including the West, more traditions around making sure that people were ready for those experiences, they were being held in a safe way, and they were kind of, it was happening in an orderly fashion.
I don't, not being part of the indigenous culture, I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that it has a lot to do with community holding of the experience. And I can tell you an experience I had in Peru in 1987. We did San Pedro out in the mountains, in the hills above Cusco, and we came back to the hotel, and all the staff would just quietly smile at us, and they understood. They knew what we were up to. They knew what we were doing, and they held us. And I just had this amazing experience of, this is important. This is the culture holding this situation is how it becomes healing. And we're not there. We're not there yet.
That's a really interesting thing that I'd been mulling over for a little while, that, we're doing psychedelics in a different culture and a different community. I come from a Asian community, which is often more tight-knit and more tribal in its way of being. And, mental health is seen differently within that community. Care for elders is seen differently in that community. And so immediately you've got these different rules and different structures that happen, and psychedelics obviously have come from some of those communities, but we don't have the same communities anymore. We're in the West, people will take them, they don't go back to communities, they're on their own, and that's really isolating. And so that's something that I have myself been wondering about. How do you keep people safe in some form of community when they go back into a society which is much more individualistic?
Yeah, and I've even thought, is it ethical for someone to engage in a psychedelic period of their life where they're entering into treatment or medicine if they lack community and support? Maybe if they lack health insurance, they lack, ongoing psychotherapy, if they lack maybe financial means and stability to do the work, is it ethical for them to continue, to do something that could potentially be the most powerful, most challenging experience of their life?
And if they lack a network that understands them and supports them.
Part of where I think we could go next is, we've talked about ethics not being like a list of bullet points and principles. It's something more experiential, internal, and awareness focused. And I'm also thinking the informed consent principle here. I often think about it as a document, as a piece of paper. Please sign this. I've done my job, check that box off. Yes, great, you've signed it. The informed consent's done. But what it actually is, as well as this piece of paper, it's a process, it's an invitation to meet someone, engage with them very authentically and vulnerably. And it might mean opening up a bit as a therapist as well in that process of what to expect, how to potentially make contingency plans and agreements about how to handle things, what not to do, plan A, plan B, plan C in psychedelic work. So just expanding like this idea of informed consent and laying the groundwork in the relationship with that person. So ethics is kind of woven into the interaction and dialogue with that person. So any thoughts that pop up for either of you, if you're okay to jump into that one?
Yeah, I think you've talked about talking about what might happen. And I think Stan Grof's cartography of the psyche is a really good thing to use. The kinds of experiences that might happen in any extraordinary state of consciousness, but also talking about the roles and the functions. Like we're talking now in this first discussion about what this psychedelic experience is going to be. And I would say, and my role is to give you information and to help us come to agreements. But my role is going to be different in the session itself and what that is like. And so I think all those things and the agreements, agreements like no violent behavior, no violence toward others, no or self, and no sex, no sexual acting out with another person, and no property damage, and please follow directions in an emergency, like if we have an earthquake or something. And then talking about touch and those agreements and what is your feeling about touch and what consent would you like to give. And these are the ways that touch is important sometimes in a psychedelic session. And these are the ways that it might not be wanted. And how are you going to tell me if something isn't wanted or something is wanted? And I will ask you again in the session just to be sure that you want something. So, and if you say no touch, then that's a firm decision. I'm not going to touch you, even if you change your mind in the session this time, but we can do it differently in a second session.
So you're really delineating that there might be different ethical issues or principles in talk therapy work or pre and post work compared to, say, the medicine, the dosing session as well, about how to navigate them.
I think that pre-session is a relatively ordinary state of consciousness. There's still power dynamics because we practitioners have more information, but it's not usually an extraordinary state of consciousness in that session. But then you go into the session itself, and what I like to say is the expert becomes the inner healer in the session. So the practitioner is more of a doula, in the midwifery sense, a sitter, a doula, helping something emerge or supporting the emergence of whatever expanding thing or healing thing is happening, but not getting in the way and being very, very careful not to interfere or direct.
Yeah, and that can be really important to explain to the client so they have realistic expectations about this is my role. So we have to know first what is my role, and then 2, what my boundaries are, make agreements with the client, and then 3, make sure that they're aware of my role and the boundaries and the limits and the nature of the work. Shabina, what other thoughts are bubbling away for you?
I was just so interested in what Kylea was saying. I just kind of went along with like, oh yeah, I need to write that down, and oh yeah, I need to write that one down. So I was just having a moment of listening to a wiser elder speak and go, yeah, that's really important to remember that all those details are super important for people. And I guess if I just speak about my own experiences, I think that they changed every time I did psychedelics. So what I needed in terms of my boundaries shifted in each journey. Maybe I became more comfortable. I certainly remember not wanting touch the first time, but being fine with it the second. It was, and maybe that nature of checking in with that client and seeing as things evolve where they are, because process does change people, and maybe the next piece of healing work that they might do might bring them into a place where they might need that thing, whereas they might not have the time before. I like all the structure. I like talk about the power dynamics, because there is a power dynamic, and I think that power dynamic is really important for us to really be aware of, because if we're not aware of it, we can bring in our own biases, our own thoughts, and sometimes I feel like we can, without meaning to, steer people. If we're not aware of, okay, am I steering here? Am I kind of suggesting something? Are they comfortable? Tuning into them and not having, not perhaps being abrasive, or, being gentle with that, bringing them into the process, because it is quite scary. It's quite a big thing to do for people. So just really remembering that, because I think once you're in it and you've been doing it for a while, maybe you forget how daunting it can be. I mean, even therapy, when you first go and have therapy with a new therapist, is daunting, let alone doing a psychedelics kind of retreat or experience. Is super scary. So just remembering that.
Yeah, I think when you forget, that's the time to do another session yourself. To remember. There's one other role that besides the inner healer becoming the expert and the practitioner becoming the doula, the practitioner really becomes the protector of the client's physical and sometimes emotional state. And this happens like, they, if somebody wants to run outside the room and jump off the balcony, that is your job to protect them from doing that. So I think that's important, because they have surrendered their ordinary state of consciousness where they would never do that, and are relying on you, the practitioner, to keep them safe.
That's a really powerful point, isn't it? Being that a protector, but without having, a power asymmetry that, we get overly directive and overly involved and overly interpreting and intervening. It's not that. Really, we're trying to be as non-directive during medicine work as possible. But when we're called upon to say, hey, I need your protection right now because I am freaking out, or I am a risk to myself, or I'm going to smash things up, or I'm going to go kind of run across the road, whatever it might be, or I'm going to jump off like some of the stigmatizing beliefs around psychedelics, everyone's going to jump out of a window. They don't worry. But yeah, how do we handle that? How do we handle that if it does happen?
Some have jumped off cliffs or off balconies. So it is a real thing that you have to keep the person safe.
I've got to say, I did consider whether or not I would ever work with somebody who was much bigger than me.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm not sure I could, because how would I keep them safe if they were able to overpower me? So I guess there is that element of considering your own scope of what you can manage.
Well, you do have an agreement in ordinary state of consciousness about not harming self or others or property. And you can remind people if you have that initial agreement. And usually that works. But I know your hesitation. In holotropic breathwork, we have room full of people, some facilitators and extra sitters who weren't busy at the time if somebody really needed restraining for some reason. There was the person power available, but you don't have that in an individual session.
Part of the discussion around what to expect is, in a sense, a separate discussion about what is normal and what is abnormal. We could call them non-ordinary states of consciousness. I also like calling them extraordinary states of consciousness. And I don't like the word normal because I don't think anything it really is. Like, we live in this planet in an infinite universe that is, hundreds of billions of light years across. So, what's normal and not normal? But what can happen in a psychedelic session, it can be very abnormal, like contact with monsters, spirits, ancestors, whatever it might be. So really, out of the box, things could come up. So we really need to be able to say, okay, this might be abnormal as we would consider it in our culture and society here in the West, and maybe, you know, more universally. But how do we still engage with it in a skillful way? Because we still have that accountability to the client around kind of navigating it with them and not making them feel like, whoa, now that, you know, even afterwards, like, oh, that was just some weird stuff that came up. Don't worry about that. Like, really, without trying to over-interpret it as well. So any nuggets that either of you have around working with clients, so you're not over-interpreting, but you're really validating and helping them kind of go into it in the moment, doing non-ordinary states work as well as afterwards doing integration work.
Well, I think it helps to just consider it all normal and not abnormal, because it's only abnormal in the context of our society and our culture. You know, what happened to indigenous people in their psychedelic experiences was held. Whatever it was held by the culture. So it was not abnormal. It was normal in the extraordinary state of consciousness. And they assumed that it was healing, and worked with it. And I think the difference between, I think the shaman does more healing, energetic healing, themselves than we are trained to do. But I think it's normal for them to act, to have any kind of experience, because that's what comes up.
I guess I sit in the position of the unknown. You know, I don't know. I can't know everything. And if that person's brain is taking them to that place because that's really significant as an experience for them, then that's significant for them. And my job is to kind of stay there with them and allow them to, you know, sort of sit in that experience, take it apart in the way that they need to make it meaningful for them. I guess that sitting in the unknown keeps me safe, because I can't possibly know everything, right? It's I'm no expert there. That's how I feel. I feel like the power dynamic really does get wiped out in those places, because I think you can see things that, you know, may not make sense on the outside, but to that person on the inside, they really do make sense. And they make sense of it in a way that is far more profound than you could ever interpret or analyze or try and take apart. And that organicity within them allows them, as you were saying, to heal somewhat. And yeah.
I think it's either healing or expanding work. And sometimes things get in the way of that, and they have to work through that. But I think that's the outcome that is available when the psychedelic opens the door.
I love that we're expanding this, that everything is normal. I think I needed to hear that for many reasons, Kylea. Thank you. Because I think, you know, we're culturally conditioned to think there's this very narrow veneer of what is normal and everything else is abnormal. Even death and dreams and, you know, psychosis, it's abnormal. But, you know, this is all normal because it's part of our human experience, and non-ordinary states are part of that. I've got one. Oh, go ahead, Kylea.
Well, I was just going to reiterate that that's why I think it's so important to have these groups for people, so that they can realize that they had a normal experience, because they're not going to get more people they know who, in this culture, who would think it is abnormal. Oh, you better see a shrink about that. Something like that.
I wanted to ask a quick question. I guess we're coming towards the end here, but we've spoken about that inner awareness a few times. More specifically, awareness of, why am I doing this? Both as a client, you know, going through the process of treatment, but also as the practitioner. Like, why do I want to do this job? Why do I want to do this, you know, serving medicine or sitting during a ketamine or MDMA session? What's my motivation for doing this? I think that's really, really important for us to ask that question. Like, it's quite a hard one to answer if I'm being honest here. Like, what is our motivation for doing this work? So, any senses there about how we can explore that within us?
Psychedelics.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well, I think one thing that we have to decide as normal is that we have many selves, and sometimes they have different motivations. But I think it's good to find out as much as we can about all of them and their motivations, and see if we can get them working together. But very common motivations is I want to be a healer. I want to have an effect on somebody positively in their life, or I want to know about myself, or just, this is interesting. This is like more interesting than watching TV series. It's like it's more emotional, it's more exciting, and then you have to ask yourself, well, why do I want something more emotional or exciting? What's going on with me? And I think we kind of get to a place that's more like a bodhisattva, that, well, this is mine to do. This is my seva. This is my service. And I will do a certain amount of that, and then I will have my life, and I will take care of my needs in my life. But I really want to be of service to others, and I feel like this is a very good way to do that.
I'd like to share my first psychedelic journey was exactly that. So I was shown that was what I was here for. It was, oh, this is the beauty of creation. This is relationships. You are part of these relationships, and this is how you're going to feel connected to these relationships. And I just got to see this cycle of beautiful helpers who were coming in and helping everyone, and then this amazing music and this lovely setting. And it just kept, the message just kept reiterating. And I was like, oh, okay. Thank you, medicine. That's very kind of you to show me that with all the difficulties that we face, this is a way to be with people.
Thank you,
So
Shabina. Yeah,
for that question.
yeah,
Beautiful.
I think that's really beautifully put, and I can say, personally speaking, that's kind of why I'm here. My own personal experiences, with psychedelics and cannabis, but with healing, with trauma work, and that's kind of really my main motivation for being here. And I'm interested in maybe one final question. This has been great so far. Just breathing into the spaces that we're opening up. If the work we're talking about happens in an ethical way, so that everyone involved is following the principles, the skills that we're talking about here, and 5-10 years time down the track, whatever, let's just think about what impact's that going to have. What's it going to look like? How do we hope the kind of outcomes of having this ethical psychedelic assisted therapy reality for those folks that it is being done in an ethical way, because not everyone is going to do it 100% of the time, but let's just focus on those parts of the reality that evolves from this. What's going to be the maybe cumulative benefit from that? Why is this, in a sense, so important when we're looking at the evolution of this kind of breakthrough treatment hitting the world right now? Why is ethics so important in that, to shape how we experience this kind of burgeoning experience with psychedelic medicine and healing?
I think more people will discover what is theirs to do, what is their piece of the collective puzzle, and they will be able to do it, and we will all benefit. And I think the practitioner will benefit by getting their answer to what they why they wanted to do this. They will get the outcome that they needed, and they also will have more relationship skills from the process of being a practitioner for the rest of their life and the rest of their relationships. And the whole field of therapeutics, psychedelics, will have less harm. Because I think if people really find out what is theirs to do and do it, that is so satisfying that all these other things that cause problems for other people disappear. But that's really the long-term version of this. I think there's a lot of hoops and tunnels to go through.
Yeah, let's jump through them together. Lovely. Thanks, Kylea. And Shabina, what are some of your thoughts around this?
I guess I think of ethics being this kind of umbrella that kind of all of us can be under, and a place to explore maybe our shadows, the parts of us that are hidden. And I feel that the more we come into contact with ourselves and our shadows, and we align in the way that we are with ourselves and with others, the kinder, the more compassionate, the more centered we are, it will spread. And for me, that's the hope, is that it continues to keep spreading, because although there is harm in the community at the moment, and there's been harm in therapy for years, it's not new. I also see people talking about this so much more openly now, in more casual conversations. I see the younger generations just full of zest and way less fearful, of those conversations, and way less shameful around those conversations. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope that this energy will kind of, it will just get bigger, and then we can treat ourselves, others, the planet in a more right relationship, a more compassionate relationship. So I'm a bit of a visionary, really. So, and I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen.
Thanks, Shabina. Yeah, I'm breathing into that, and it feels great. It really does. We're doing our own work on our own shadow. We're helping others work through theirs, and our collective shadow. It helps us just kind of feel into it, own it, and see it, and just admit that it does exist, and we've got some collective work to do. I'd love to, and you're kind of saying you're seeing it happening already, particularly with the younger generations, around the fears that we've got. Any kind of closing thoughts either of you wanted to share before we say toodaloo?
I'm glad that you're doing this work and that you have a training for people and considering all these things. And thank you for inviting me. And it's really been a pleasure to meet Shabina and see all the things we have in common.
Yeah, I'd like to say the same. It's been almost a year now of Vital, and I met a great bunch of people and a lovely community and some amazing teachers who have been really inspiring to listen to. And thank you for today. It went a lot more, left field than I was expecting, but it's been really nice. Thank you.
No, you got it. It's been a pleasure for me. A real honour working with both of you. And Kylea, just to thank you for the work that you've been doing for a long time, and for working with our students in Vital. It's amazing. We get to work with you kind of live, interactively, and with the videos that you've recorded, and kind of the case studies, role plays that we do. It's brilliant, really brilliant, just to learn this stuff, and it's never ending for sure. One last thing, just tell people if they want to find you or get more information about your work. Kylea, I know you've written some books as well, so tell people about it. Kylea, do you want to jump in first?
Yes, Shabina has the book she can hold up. It's my website is InnerEthics.com, and you can reach me through that website.
Yeah, and your book's called InnerEthics. Do you have a couple of books out? I can't remember.
No, it's called The Ethics of Caring.
Ethics of Caring. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Shabina just showed it for folks watching on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book. I've got to say, it was nice to return, but return in a different way. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the other videos that you're putting out, Kylea. They'd be really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Shabina, tell people about yourself if they want to find out more and the practice that you've got in the down in London. In what's that forest called as well that you live in?
It's the New Forest.
The
It's
New
in the
Forest.
south.
Yeah, the old one was
Yeah.
crap, wasn't it? The new one's much better.
It's full of wild ponies and wild animals. I run a practice in London. They're a lovely bunch of clinicians who are all equally interested in all the new fields. And yeah, it'd be nice to connect with people if they're in the UK, because it's nice to have a community.
All right. Well, I'm overjoyed. So happy we got to have this chat. I think the two of you are going to continue having more conversations that are vital ones after this. But Kylea Taylor, Shabina Hale, thank you deeply and sincerely for sharing all of these thoughts with us. Thanks for listening, everyone. God bless.